Hello everyone and welcome to Mastering FX Level 2. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope that you guys will find this workshop very useful and informative. My name is Saber and I'm the co-founder of Rebelway and your instructor for the next 10 weeks. I wanted to use this week to discuss everything that goes into making something like this. And I wanted to go into stuff that we generally don't talk about in terms of concepts, idea, hardware, requirements. And I wanted to point out that our team at Rebelway is quite involved in creating visual effects for TVs, film, and commercial. And we have a setup. We have a small studio that is capable of producing high quality visual effects that you see in films and TVs. And we have the opportunity to use that same setup, the same equipment to create high quality trainings. And our goal from the beginning is to produce the highest quality training and show people what it actually means to work in production and what it actually requires to be able to produce something like this. And I'm going to talk about everything in this workshop. I'm going to talk about the hardware, I'm going to talk about storage, I'm going to talk about time, cost, and everything needed to produce something like this. There's also another thing that generally is left over or not talked about, is the idea, the concept that you are working on. Now, a lot of the skilled director or VFX supervisors, they have the skill where they can see something just written in text, and they can imagine it in a way that it's going to work on screen. That skill, unfortunately, is not something easy to teach. It comes with experience. And I'm going to share as much as possible with you guys so that you can have a good starting point to start to think about this problem where you have an idea that you will know it's gonna actually work. A lot of times you start something, you have an idea, you start something, but it doesn't look as good as you want it to be, or it doesn't have the feel that you're looking for. And that skill, unfortunately, comes with a lot of iteration and a lot of experience. Now, our team doesn't have a concept artist who is sitting and just doing visual R&Ds in 2D concepts where we can say, okay, I want to make these 10 changes. This is what I want. This is going to look perfect in the final screen. We don't have that resource. So we do a lot of extra R&D in Houdini and in 3D to try and nail down the actual visual that is going to work, the actual language. And as I said, this is something that requires a lot of iteration, a lot of experience, and you have to try some of your ideas. You have to test them out and see how it goes. And if it doesn't work, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Not every idea we have is going to look fine on screen. This workshop itself, I have tried three different other ideas that didn't pan out. And I just dropped them and I stick with this. And I'm going to go into more details as to how this started and how I got here. And I wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of this skill. It's not about Houdini. It's not about knowing how to do destruction or how to do simulation in Houdini. It's about what you're going to create and the visual and the storytelling that you're going to make. In this workshop, we're going to talk about the concept. We're going to talk about the behind the scenes. We're going to talk about CPUs, hardware, and things like that, time, cost. And then we're going to break down the project into a couple of modules. Destruction, smoke, rendering, particles, the magical effects, and then lava. And each one will have various problems. We're going to list those problems and try to develop solutions in Houdini. And as we go, every time we do this, you guys will acquire new skills. You will see how we actually can solve that problem. And by acquiring all this knowledge towards the end, you should have a huge knowledge available at your disposal on how you can achieve creating or solving a complex visual effects problem. That means simulation, destruction, and also visual storytelling. It has to look good in the end. It doesn't matter how heavy the sim is. It doesn't matter how complex the setup for destruction is. It has to look good. And that's something that hopefully in the next 10 weeks will give you guys the next 10 weeks will give you guys enough chance to explore some of that. And again, in this week, we're just going to go over the various bits that we're going to cover in the next 10 weeks, give you guys some material to start working on. And then as we progress, we'll start going through the list and getting stuff done. I wanted to create this video to explain who this workshop is for and what the prerequisites are in order to fully understand what we're going to be doing in the next 10 weeks, and it's not too hard for you. Now, our goal from the beginning is to create high-end trainings, but we couldn't just do that from the beginning. We couldn't go in and say, okay, this is how you do the most advanced shot. We have to start and work with our students, and that's what we've been doing. We've taught water, we've taught pyro, we've taught destruction, we've given introduction to Houdini, and that gives us a layout or a base foundation for students that now we can work with. They know us, they know the language, they know Houdini, they know how we think, and they're going to be able to talk at a senior level with us. And that's the goal that we were hoping for from the beginning. And this workshop is the first one in that series. And we're going to be doing more like this. We want to build up. We don't want to go down and do more beginner workshops. We think there's a lot of stuff out there, and we want to progress. We want to focus on the more complex, the more advanced topics. And it is very, very crucial that we work with students who have gone through these steps. Otherwise, we're going to be teaching something and you're not going to be able to fully understand it. Because imagine we teach you part 1 and this is part 2. If you haven't taken part 1, you're not going to understand the full story. You're not going to be able to acquire or get the skills that we hope you get. And I've made this workshop primarily for destruction students and pyro students. I've included the introduction to effects, to Houdini for FX artists, for the purpose of giving them a chance to see something like this. But most likely, if you've only taken the introduction to Houdini for FX artists, this is going to be really, really hard to follow along. And that's perfectly fine. You can still learn quite a bit, but you'll probably have to have the destruction or the pyro workshop to be able to acquire everything needed to follow us along and find this digestible and not too hard for you. And so I wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of this, and welcome and thank you so much for joining us. And I hope that we will reach our goal and teach you what you guys are looking for. In this video, I wanted to talk primarily to the student who only took the introduction to Houdini for FX artists, and wanted to make sure that you are aware of what we're going to be doing. Now, the introduction to Houdini for FX artists is aimed at students who never used Houdini before and don't have FX skills, or have FX skills but never used Houdini before. So when you join us, depending on what your level is, you're going to be doing two things, which is quite hard. You're going to be learning what FX is, what particle is, what destruction is, what smoke is, and what you can create using all these things. Once you fully understand that, then you can start using Houdini and its tools to create those visuals. Okay, now if you haven't mastered that part, getting into the mastering FX level 2 and starting this project can be challenging and will be very challenging, because we're not going to go into details as to why we do this, why we do that. We're just going to go and talk about the bigger scope. I'm going to still teach as best as I can, but it's going to be hard. I'm not going to be able to explain what point is. I'm not going to be able to explain what passes are, what atmosphere is, what volume, what advection is. You have to be fully comfortable with all these terms, okay, in order for you to follow along. And it's perfectly fine if you feel overwhelmed with this workshop. I highly recommend, if that is the case, to join a different workshop, that is the Mastering Pyro or Destruction, one of these. Finish those completely and then come back and do this workshop, and we're more than happy to add you to a different session and work with you so you make sure you get the support that you need. This video is dedicated to the student who took the Mastering Pyro FX level 1, and I wanted to provide some guidance as to how to work on the content of the Mastering FX level 2 and how it's going to go. And this workshop contains destruction, pyro, particle sims, and a lot of rendering, edge displacement, a lot of compositing. And I am not reusing the same technique that I used in pyro. Okay, the pyro workshop is very, very advanced when it comes to pyro, but it only does pyro really well for 10 weeks. This workshop has to cover we only have 10 weeks to cover a lot of topics. And I'm going to show techniques for creating smoke simulation that works really well, but it's not going to prevent you or replace the techniques that was shown in Mastering Pyro. If you have taken that workshop, you should push the quality of the smoke simulation here or in this project much higher than what I did, because the techniques that I've used are somewhat default. I have some customization, but it's not as advanced as the Pyro workshop itself, which makes sense because we only have a couple of weeks to talk about pyro, and but the pyro workshop has 10 weeks. So if you have acquired more advanced skills, you have to use them in this workshop to push the quality of whatever sim you have you're going to do. In this video, I wanted to talk to the student who took the Mastering Destruction and FX, and I wanted to explain to them that the destruction we're going to be doing here is not as advanced as the one we did in the entire 10 weeks of Mastering Destruction, and I highly encourage you guys to reuse those advanced techniques here again. It's not the same, it's similar to what we did in the destruction workshop, what I have here, but it's not as advanced because I don't have 10 weeks to explain all that content again. And I highly encourage you guys, whatever workshop you took, to reuse those techniques in this bigger project and try to push the quality a lot more than what I did, or create something different. And that's pretty much it. We're going to be reusing knowledge from the various workshops, but we're not going to recreate and re-explain the same techniques shared. Each workshop will contain something different. And as I was saying, if you took the destruction and pyro, you should have the complete picture of how you can push the quality of smoke, destruction, as well as probably particle sims, because there's more techniques there. But with this workshop, we're going to focus on these topics, do something of high quality, but it's not the same. It's not as advanced as those workshops. I'm going to start discussing the project ideas and how it started and what we're going to be doing in the next 10 weeks and the thought process that went behind it. I'm going to play this clip one time, and then we're going to play it again and pause at different sections and explain what's happening, what's included, what we're going to be doing, and then in the next video we're going to talk about the idea and how it started and show a lot more R&D. Now, after those two shots, which are the main shots, the ground collapse and then the spaceship flying over a cracked ground, those are the two main shots, but there's also a lot of stills and R&D that I included towards the end. This is not everything. I have a lot more that I'm going to be showing, and this is another view of that top shot. And this is some R&D from the destruction of the spaceship coming up, but without the ship, because it looks cool. And this is some initial R&D of the ground collapsing, some lava R&D. And this is the initial ground collapse before I started adding fire. That's pretty much it. So let's go back, and I'm going to go over the various segments and discuss what we have. So as you can see, we have a ground. It looks like it's not on Earth. It looks more like a different planet. And there's mountains surrounding it. There's atmosphere. And then we have the ground starts to collapse. You can see cracks here and cracks in the center. And then this lightning happened. And then we have this force, this lightning force expanding, and it's actually following the crack patterns. And as it hits the end bits, the end of its path, it's going to cause the destruction to rotate more. It looks like it because it's just of timing, but that's the idea. This energy is gonna cause the ground to get disrupted more, and then as the ground cracks, once it opens up, fire comes from underneath, and it continues to burn. You can see it burning here. It's emitting ashes. It's emitting sparks everywhere. You can see small tornado effects here with swirling particles and normal particles here, and then smoke. Obviously, I have multiple layers, which I'll talk about now. So I have main smoke from the debris, and then we have fire from the cracks. So those are the two layers. They look like they are part the same one, but they're not. I'm gonna go later as to why I did this. So this is the first shot, and then we have, obviously, after the ground collapse, we have a lot of debris coming off the various areas. I have debris coming from the lightning. So as I progress here, you can see that the cracks itself emits debris, and it emits sparks colored differently, and then also the main destruction has debris itself. So let's go back. So the main destruction has a lot of debris, and then as the spaceship rises, it's gonna cause another. Well, I'm not gonna say anything at the moment. We'll talk about that more later, but it's gonna lift the ground, and then more pieces are going to crumble. So that's destruction simulation, including the initial part. So that's the shot 1, which is a lot of stuff. And then this shot, which is the second part, is basically I have a huge geometry here with blocks of rocks, like massive cliffs, and there is a huge cracks between each cliff. And those cracks are actually emitting fire. And then between the main crack here, I have lava flowing through, and it's actually moving. It's just because the camera is going this way and the lava going that way, it doesn't look like it's moving enough, but it is moving. And then I have smoke everywhere. So all this is smoke. It's not coming from those cracks. And these cracks, they have sparks, they have smoke, and they have fire. And then we have this main atmospheric effects with smoke simulation. Cool. So that's the main project, which includes the ground collapse, the energy, the destruction, the fire, smoke, pretty much everything, and then tons of rendering. And then some stills from different stages, which I will talk about more in the next video. But that's the initial scope. Now, the idea behind this is that I wanted to have a spaceship that comes off the ground, and I didn't want the spaceship just to start pushing the ground, because that's not going to give me room to create any impactful visual. So I decided to collapse the ground. Okay, once the ground collapsed, then we can have, I wanted to have initial, basically action, reaction, and delay. And I wanted to have the ground collapse with a small pause, which is basically that phase where the ground starting to collapse and hits that point. And then I wanted to have something meaningful, something impactful. That's where the lightning comes in. I wanted to have that powerful lightning hit, which causes either the ground to start burning after it cracks, or something is going to happen, but it's an impactful moment. It has meaning. And then after all this, the spaceship is going to be able to still push through all that fire and comes off all underneath all this lava and hot environment. Now, the truth is, it didn't start with this idea. It started with this idea. And I'm going to show it here. So see this picture here? This is where everything started from. And I'm going to show the concept and the artist. Well, actually here. Yeah, his name is Andreas Rocha. And I'm going to show a concept that he did that I got inspired from. So I wanted to do this. I wanted to create an interesting environment with the ground cracked, a lava flowing in the center, a lot of hot smoke simulation, a lot of sparks coming off this huge crack, and then a spaceship traveling through this crack. And I wanted to, the beginning idea, the first idea, I wanted to have the spaceship comes off the smoke. Basically, we don't see it in the beginning, but then as it starts moving, it's gonna come off the smoke, and it's gonna cause all these lightning or some sort of atmospheric disruption where you see like an aurora effect or lightning effect. And then as it travels through, I wanted to have some sort of chains that hits the spaceship and tries to hold it because it's trying to escape. And the chains will be under the ground somehow. I wasn't sure how to do that, and I wanted the spaceship to pull them to the point that it breaks the grounds at various levels. So let's say the spaceship is here, we have chains attached to it, but they are underneath the ground. I want the spaceship to pull that and causes the ground to destroy the ground, pulls the chain, breaks them apart, and then still goes through. And I wanted to have a lot of smoke here so that when the spaceship flies, we can have a lot of interesting movements. And that will include destruction, that will include a lot of sims. I was just trying ideas. But then I realized that the project is quite tricky. Being able to do this large scale with huge depth and huge atmosphere and having everything available in the shot is quite hard. And this geometry itself was very high res, like it's very, very dense. I'll show you in a bit. And I wanted to have something lighter. So I said, okay, instead of the spaceship being visible, how about I make it go under the ground first, and then the ground crack collapses here, and then it flies through. So there is more focus on the ground collapse. And I wanted to use this framing. I said, okay, I'm going to have this cold environment. Nothing is available. We see a lot of steams, a lot of fire coming off, and then something comes off the ground, and that's the spaceship. And I was thinking I could do the ground collapse from this camera, so it doesn't have to be very high res. As I progressed through the shot, I realized that this part here, which I'll show more in the next video, this framing is actually quite slow and very hard for me to work with. Unless I was bound to a client, I wasn't going to stick to it because it was very, very expensive. And to make right now, it doesn't look very interesting to me. I have to make it more interesting, so I need to populate the environment and so on. This is not the latest version. I'll still show more because I still worked on that quite a lot. And as I progressed through the project, I realized that the crack and the ground collapse could be a cooler idea, and that's where the first part came. And so I spent pretty much 2 months working on this. And then I said, okay, I'm going to get this fly through from the top. I will use that shot, maybe frontal camera, but I'm going to focus on the ground collapse. So I spent another 3 months working on the ground collapse, I think. And that's where most of the time was spent. And the reason I picked this is because I don't have that huge depth. It's simpler to render. We don't have a huge perspective, and it's gonna look interesting, I'm pretty sure. So the thought process is quite long for this, and I'm gonna try to break it down into videos. I think it's very, very important. We won't be having a lot of technical stuff this week, but I think this is crucial to understand what went into making this. So I was saying that the idea for the crack was too hard, and I wanted to focus on this shot more and make the ground collapse look really, really, really nice. And then obviously I started coming up with a list of ideas. So okay, I have ground collapse, and then the spaceship is gonna rise. But now we're close up. We're very close to the shot. If I'm just gonna do that, it's not gonna look very, very, very interesting, at least for me. I need to make it more dynamic. So I started developing ideas, which I'm going to show. And that's where, after developing, trying different things, I ended up with this crack that is expanding, this magical force. And then I implemented that. I did R&D. It worked. And the first time I did the ground collapse, I didn't have any fire. It was just that lightning. It's going to cause the ground to get destroyed. And then after it gets destroyed, the spaceship is going to come up. It's going to have a lot of smoke, which is basically all this without the fire. And then I was showing it to a couple of my friends, and Igor said, what if after the crack, we get fire burning underneath the ground? It shows that this spaceship is living in a hot environment. And I told him, like, that's a great idea. So I started developing. I took a small section and started doing R&D. And it worked. It looked nice. It looked very, very interesting. And I already have the setup for the fire from the other shot, which I already started. And that includes sparks. And I just replugged that in, did a quick test, and I knew it was going to work. And so I added the fire in. And then with the fire comes a lot of responsibility. So I wanted to have the fire follow through the cracks nicely. You can see, so I'm going to zoom in. You can see here rocks falling, and the fire is only emitted where there is gaps. It's dynamic. It's not fake. It's actually following the correct geometry. And this area, because there's a lot of destruction there's a lot of gap, we see more fire, but it's natural. It's because there's more gaps underneath. And see, it didn't crack enough. It's just where you see cracks, you're gonna get fire. So the emission is based on the destruction geometry. And that looked nice. And I wanted to get some nice emission from these cracks. So I want them to make sure that they burn. I can see that something is hot underneath them. So that's something visual, which I will talk about. I'll continue talking about this, so to cover all the points. And again, so this is the initial idea, which is the top shot. And this is where everything started. And then I switched to focus more on the ground collapse. But this is where I did the fire and sparks R&D. Here you can see I have fire and I have sparks and I have a lot of atmo. I have the lava and I built the geometry as well. So I've gathered all the images that I think will have useful information, and I'm just gonna go over them and talk about them, share some information, and to give you guys some ideas. And again, we don't have a concept artist. We don't have a visual effects supervisor or James Cameron sitting telling us, I want this, it's gonna work, it's gonna look nice. We have to do stuff. We have to try things and see what works, see what doesn't work, see what we're capable of doing. And because it's our creation, unless I'm bound by a client, I'm not gonna obey that. If the topic or the scope is too hard, I'm not going to follow, because it's just unrealistic for us to spend a year working on this. So I'm going to show what I have. They're not in order, but they're grouped somewhat in a meaningful way, and I'm going to go over them and show what I have and talk about what I did and what's happening. So this is a still image of the initial ground collapsing. It's a close-up, and then with the energy in there. And this energy, I can't remember now, but I have particles, I believe I have volume, and then as the ground expands, as this energy expands, it's actually shifting the ground. It's pushing the rocks away from each other. So as this travels like this, it's gonna push the ground away from each other and rotate them, and that will give us more space to emit debris. And this is one of the frames. You can see here smoke is starting to emit, and this is the debris coming off, and you can see the Voronoi pattern is quite visible. This render, I didn't have the edge displacement on yet, which we're going to talk about. So this is another frame. And this is a very old test that I did to see how the fire would look like. You can see the resolution is quite low and it's not great, but I really liked what I saw because all this flying debris, you have a light underneath it. It's gonna, rotate and catch light every time it moves. It's gonna sparkle, basically. It's very, very interesting to look at. The fire, this hot pattern here, I love that. It looks very, very natural, and we've got all this nice emission. And then I can use this to also create the composition that I want. So I wanted to have a ring of fire, which is this, and then something in the center, and then everything else. So I wanted to use this in my advantage. And this is a great element because we have a ring of fire that could generate a lot of interesting illumination to whatever is going to happen inside versus if it wasn't there. And then we have the rest of the atmosphere, and we have the center, which we could use as the spaceship lifts off. And I will talk about other ideas that I had. This is a very early test of high-res destruction and high-res geometry. You can see here, there's a lot of details in the geometry, and there's edge displacement turned on. But the number of pieces, the number of geometry that I had is very low. So this is an initial test to see how it would look like if the spaceship, if the ground collapsed and the spaceship come off. So I wanted to do a test to see how it would look like. And then I saw that the rocks were getting stuck into the spaceship as it was coming up. So I needed to figure out something, because I didn't want that. I don't want them to get stuck, and they will get stuck. So I needed a solution. And during this discussion, I'm going to explain some of the problems that I ran into and how I solved them. And we'll get into individual details later. Okay, so this is a test, an old test that I did of the ground collapse, and some initial the fire, the sparks. This lightning is the main one, the last one. I didn't change it, but this is a test where I didn't have any fire. And this, at the time, I was using Houdini 18, which was in beta, and they added so much features towards the end. They added sparse solves, they added sparse water, they added RBD subsolver in the last minute, and it was hard for me to keep up, using the beta and the beta version. And still solving problems and things like that. But this was an initial test that I did with the smoke. And you can see that the smoke freezes. And that's because the sparse wasn't properly working at the time of the beta version. And also at this point, I wanted to start exploring different lighting scenarios. And I wanted to have... my initial idea, I wanted to have a very bright source, but not as wide as this. I wanted to have a straight line, like a laser, a very thin beam that will light everything that it hits. But I wasn't looking for that lightning itself. I was looking for the fall off of that. So I wanted to have some core and then a nice decay from that. So whenever we have something in space or like a smoke flying, we're still gonna get a nice source of lighting inside it, and it's gonna create interesting illumination. And doing the small light, the very narrow one, was very, very expensive. So I ended up using an area light and keeping it at this radius because it wasn't, it was working visually and it was giving me the lighting that I want. So I pursued that and didn't pursue the thin idea, like a slice idea. I wanted to have, like one thin line, and then as the spaceship comes up, it's gonna, a lot of lighting sources are going to be emitted, and that's gonna illuminate the scene. And I was happy with having all this pretty dark, like a different tone, so that we have contrast. Okay, so let's talk more. So this is something. When I started doing the R&D, the ground collapse, I was looking at various references, and I will show I'll show a couple of them. So the main reference is the nuclear ground collapse. So they do nuclear explosion underneath the ground, which will causes a huge gap to be created, and that will cause the ground to collapse. And one reference that came to mind was Jaden Patterson reel. He had an amazing ground collapse with a spaceship coming, and I was looking at that reference, and I was looking at the real reference, and I was trying to get some elements from both of those. And this was an initial test that I did, and I think the timing works really well, but it's still not there yet. I don't know what I was looking for. I wasn't happy with that result. So let's continue. So this is another test. Let's see this one. Yeah, so this is another version with the spaceship. Actually, it's a sphere coming off the ground. And I was looking for that timing, that beat where the ground hits and then something happens. So I was looking for the timing to find the perfect moment or the perfect timing for each element. And the ratio is what I found is the impact that the blue effect needs to happen really quick, and then the majority of the time is spent on the collapse. And this is by looking at the real reference of the nuclear explosion, which I'll show once we find it. Okay, so let's continue. So this is a still image. Again, the images and the folders are not ordered, but they all contain useful information. So this is a high-res ground of the final geometry with edge displacement, and it's still rendering. So I just did a screen capture, and you can see it's working really, really well. This is a different angle pointing this way, and let's see. And I was also exploring the shading for this. You can see there's a lot of reflectiveness here, which looks really nice, but was a bit expensive, so I had to turn it off. And this is a preview of an upres, which we will talk about later. And this is actually pretty good example. You can see the Voronoi pattern here everywhere. The fracture, the actual pieces, and you can see that everything that hits this, everything that is rising, is actually going to get fractured many, many, many times to create this nice crumbling feeling. Okay, let's continue. So this is a still image from R&D of the sparks. I was working on the effects, and I wanted to. Looking at it, I wanted to make it feel massive. And the most references that you look at, you will see small tornadoes of fire happening here and there. And I wanted to recreate that effect. And this is something we're going to talk about, obviously, on how to implement that. But it's the idea, not the technique. I think the technique can be really, really simple. So you can see curves here everywhere, and those are causing turbulence or the particles to swirl around them. And that's another preview. I don't have the twisting effect here implemented yet, but this is a preview of all the fire with all the sparks in there. This is a still image of the final render from the top. And this is a still image of the fire with the smoke and with nothing else. No sparks, nothing. And I was just testing, making progress, testing things, iterating over each part for many, many days to find the perfect tune. And especially for this one, I really wanted to get some nice contrast when the ground was flat, when the ground was collapsing, when the ground is collapsed. And this worked really, really nice. You see, like, it hits here, you get this nice break, and then there's nice shadows. You will get all this debris projecting shadows here, and then we have this part which is orange, and then another part which is blue, and there's this two combinations with the geometry worked really, really well. There's other lighting sources here, but we'll get to that later. And again, this is not about Houdini, it's about telling a story and how to use whatever you have to make it look more interesting. Let's see, we talked about that. Okay, so this is the references. I'm gonna include this one. So this is the animation references that I was looking at. And this is a nuclear explosion with showing a ground collapsing and then a smoke happening from the cracks. Now this is large, this is really big, and you can see the crack pattern is quite uniform. You get these uniform rings like this, and then once the ripple happens, it's going to emit smoke from those cracks. This is a great path to pursue if you wanted to get that uniform pattern. I didn't want to do that. I wanted something more organic, especially with the idea of the lightning. I wanted it to be more organic, but if you wanted to create this pattern, you can definitely do that. And in terms of timing, you can see how much time from 0 all the way to 120, so almost 5 seconds, 6 seconds, and then you get this first wave of white. It's not the smoke yet, it's just disruption on the ground, and then only at frame 140 is when you start to get this boom, 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 boom effect, and it happens very, very quickly. So studying clips like this is very, very important, and to find the timing, because now, okay, I can spend, when I do my sims, it has to be 5 seconds for the ground collapse, and it starts really small and quickly gets here. You know, the ring expansion, it happens rather quick. It's not, let me see. So it gets here, the entire ring is visible. That's where the effects is going to happen, but it's still collapsing. You see, it's still falling down. And so that's something we can implement. I didn't do, but that's something you can implement, where you have the ring expanding and the ground falling, and then as it continues, it still falls. As this happens, the ground is still falling. So studying these clips will give us an indication as to how long each section can be, but I didn't want it to follow this 100%. You know, I just like the beginning, and then this part here, to me, it's very slow. You know, like this, all this is very slow. I want it to happen a lot faster, maybe 3 times faster. So I wanted to show Jaden's shot. And so this is Jaden's shot. And we can also look at the timing. So 0 and then 75. He only spent 70 frames on the ground collapse, and then you see the smoke starting rather quickly. But also they have some fake comp during here. You can see this mask revealing 2 different layers, and this is painted, or it's CG, but painted on top. It's just a mask revealing. So there is a comp trick here, which I didn't use. I'm not going to rely on that because I wanted everything to be in scene. And then the smoke here may not even be emitted from the cracks itself. And this is a break of the geometry. So that, yeah, so these 2 versions, and then various layers and smoke. And this, you can see the smoke is not coming from the cracks. It's just an emission. But the timing is perfect. The timing of this shot is amazing. So I was studying the timing here and trying to find something that that works for me. Not this one. So these are other clips. I think it's the same one, just different camera. Yeah, it's the same one. Let's see this one. So this is a close-up. You can see the ground. Yeah, this is very slow collapse, very slow emission for what I wanted to achieve. But it's a great reference. You can see how long it takes. 0 to, well, it takes maybe, yeah, 15 frames, 15 seconds. And then you have the smoke effect. So that's another reference I was looking at. And then let's see. Yeah, I think it's the same. They're all the same. I don't think a lot of people recorded something like this, but that's the reference I was looking at. I wanted to have a ground collapse, and I wanted to use these as the keys, or the key for timing, just to give me an idea of how much time I can spend on the ground collapse, how quick the expansion needs to be, and so on and so forth. But I ended up changing pretty much everything to suit me. Now this is the image I was talking about. It's from a guy named Andreas Rocha, and you can Google him. He's a great artist. He has a lot of cool stuff you can definitely get a lot of ideas from. And I wanted to create this environment. And obviously I didn't want to copy the same thing, but I wanted to have some sort of crack, and then both sides are here, they're far away, and then as we travel in perspective, as we go deeper, it's going to get narrower and narrower. And I wanted to have the spaceship at the end, but you could definitely recreate this if you wanted to, but I wanted to have something a bit more different. And then I started with this. This is what started the initial project. I wanted to have a crack in the ground, lots of lava, and cool rocks, and I wanted to have a lot of sparks, fire coming off these cracks, maybe flowing lava here, flowing lava in the center, and I wanted to have this huge hot atmosphere, which turned out to be really hard and challenging to achieve, because the visual is really hard. To build something this vast and still sell the scale, the hotness of the environment, and have effect, and have rendering, have simulation integrate into it, it's a lot of work. So as I made progress on it, I realized that I need to scale down the scope and focus on one shot, which ended up the ground collapse. So that's the animation drive, same. Okay, let's continue. So this is initial R&Ds from the ground collapse. Sorry, from the crack. And I was building the environment. I'm done with the environment. I wanted to start exploring various bits and pieces. And this includes look dev for the lava, look dev for the rocks, and I wanted to start looking at the spaceship. What can I add? Also did this camera move because I wanted to see how it would work from different angles. And the one thing that comes off, or I wanted to have this spaceship with something inside the crack flowing through, and maybe do some sims in there. But looking at this, it didn't work well. You know, we have this perspective, this alignment of rocks, and then we have this object standing up. It didn't suit the framing. It didn't work well with the framing. So I decided to change the spaceship, which is this one, and I'll talk more about that once we get there. So this is more tests to see the entire environment, and this environment is not the same one I used in the ground collapse. It's the one with the rocks, and I'm gonna provide all of this. So we have this block here on the left, this block on the right. They are blended into a rocky surface, a rocky terrain, and that's being copied a few times. That's basically how I'm building it. And every time it just put them closer to each other, pardon me, and they actually close on each other. If you push them all the way through, you will be able to close the gaps. Just these cracks will still be there. So you can 100% close it. And another idea that Igor was suggesting is to have some ground here in the beginning of the shot and have it crumble and collapse onto the lava. But it was just too hard, too slow for me to have this entire huge environment and the effects as well. So as I was working on this, looking at the various images, this is where the ground collapse is going to happen. I didn't like the spaceship, and the spaceship I've bought from this guy, not this guy, this guy, millionth vector, and it's a great model. And we've bought the rights to it, so we're going to include it with this workshop. And the version that I have is actually a modified version of this that I'm also going to include. So not this one. Okay, so let's get back. So we're going to include that spaceship. And this is the second iteration on the spaceship. So you can see it's the same one. There's a version here, the one that was vertical, but I rotated it and made two copies, one pointing to the left and mirrored it one to the right. And that's how I got my spaceship. And I like this silhouette because it's easy to frame, it's easy to embed in the crack. And at this point, I didn't have the idea of the ground collapse yet. I was just trying to get this to work as good as possible. And by that time I was done with the lava. I had the lava flowing and I had cracks, and these are individual sims, high-res sims with sparks following the motion of the smoke, and I needed to simulate all this. So each one of them is actually very, very high res, and I set up a system for clustering. And basically you work on one crack and then you say, okay, now go sim all the other cracks. Everything was named properly. Everything was easy to read. And then, yeah, we'll talk more about the problems later, but there's more issues on how to manage this and render this that I had to solve, which I did. And also all the smoke. And at this point, when doing this, I was trying to make it to look as good as possible. So I wanted to have the spaceship to have lightning obviously affect this. Even though it's not realistic, it works because this fire is supposed to be super, super bright. Nothing else will be able to compete with it. But I wanted to have something blue here or something different as the spaceship travels to show and reveal how the smoke is interacting. Another thing that was quite expensive is the specular here. It's actually a reflection. And to get that, to get the reflection of all this fire from this angle was quite expensive to render, because each ray will probably hit something or a lot of this smoke and particles, and that needs to be reflected. So it was quite hard. Okay, so let's continue. More stills from this environment. I'm just going to go over the various images and show what I did. So this is a test with the initial geometry. You can see there is no illumination in the cracks, and then I did illumination here in these cracks to make it look more interesting. And this is an initial idea for a ground collapse. Maybe I can show a clip. I'm gonna delete this because we already saw it. I'm gonna delete these two. Yes. Okay, so I was working on the crack and I wanted to try different ideas. Okay, what if instead of, before I got to the point to have the lightning idea, I wanted to say, okay, what if the ground starts collapsing and as soon as the rock separates, something is gonna escape. Something is gonna escape from the crack. And I started experimenting. So, okay, I can emit a lot of sparks. Those sparks will emit a lot of debris, and then I'm gonna get a lot of interesting illumination. So I started exploring this. But this is another one with smoke, debris is being emitted. You can see the smoke. You can see particles are sliding here. And I wanted to explore this idea, and the spaceship is starting to come off. I wanted to explore this idea, but the main issue I was having is that it didn't have this something impactful. You know, it was very slow. If we see the same thing over and over for many, many seconds, I didn't want that. I wanted to have timing. I wanted to have action, delay, and action, reaction, and delay, or something like that. And this was just, it didn't have that momentum. It didn't have that feel. So I stopped pursuing that path. Okay, let's continue. So this is an earlier test of the lava with the crack environment, and I was testing using an older spaceship. This is the one we used for Rise, a very old version of Rise that Igor and I did. And I was testing to see, okay, what is this going to look like? And I was exploring with the shading. I was trying different ideas for you can see there's a lot of details here. I wanted to make it feel more interesting. And then I started experimenting with some ideas. What if the spaceship, as it travels through, it's going to attract energy to it? You know, it's sucking something from the atmosphere. And I wanted to have this kind of aurora effect in there, just to see how it may look like. And this one idea that I didn't pursue. So another test of look dev for the rock and the environment with the spaceship added, different frame for the spaceship, and the spaceship was red at this frame, and then a different version. And this is a very early test of the fire using Houdini 18. And then a different framing with this spaceship. And I actually liked this. The first time I did this angle, I liked it because the camera is at the same distance. It's somewhat the same distance from everything we see. So if I optimize it to work in here, it's going to be fine. The other one with the depth, each volume is behind the other one. Each volume is behind the one next to it. That traversing, that depth is going to be really, really hard to render. So for me, looking at them at this angle is actually going to be easier to render. You know, I don't know if that makes sense. It does, because if you put 10 volumes, one behind each other, to see the last one, you have the Arnold or the render has to traverse all those volumes to calculate and come back. If we look at them from the top, we don't have to do that. And that's why I like this angle, because it was easier to render and I think it could work. And it also gave me an opportunity where I could blend this even if I didn't have the crack or the ground collapse in here. Okay, so this is another frame. I was working more on the lava shader, doing tweaks in comp. You can see here there's some haze, some sky glow and stuff like that. And it was okay, but it didn't click yet. This one, it clicked. This one I really liked because the spaceship sells really well. You can see the framing is perfect. We have this almost like the golden ratio. You can feel that this is well positioned. This triangle here. This triangle here is of the same proportions, and then we have another triangle. So there's nice composition in this framing. I really like this one, and I wanted to pursue it. It's just that it was too slow for me to include towards the end. That's why I did the front shot, but I wanted to have something like this. And the blue effect is working. If this is gonna travel through with some nice smoke, haze, and particles, it's gonna look really, really nice. And with this, I was also exploring the environment, the time of day, what kind of lighting are we in? Are we at daytime? Are we at nighttime? And how I'm gonna balance all of that. Because if I wanted to have dark environment, then this rocks means it has to be magma-like. It has to be really dark. So I was trying all these compositions to see what could work. And every time I come back to this, it worked. this one clicks really well. So that's the one I pursued. If I had time, I would go finish this one for sure. So this is another early test. I basically worked on one sim. It looked great. I then ran it across a batch of all the cracks, and then because this entire block is a copy, I just copied the sims and I offsetted them, and it was working. This one was good. Yeah, this one was good. But as I said, it was quite slow, and I wanted to test what it would look if the camera was moving, if we're trying to follow the spaceship because it's leaving, what it would look like. And I did some comp blur in Nuke, and it actually looks very, very interesting with the spaceship being the focus. You know, the camera is parented to the spaceship and the environment is blurred. It looks interesting. This is interesting. These are other frames, other test frames. You can see the spaceship is closer. It's illuminating the smoke, even though the smoke is not very realistic here. This is another test from the top view. Yeah, and this is one of the final images I used, or the final comp I used. And you can see this smoke, the cracks here, they're not aligned. Okay, they're not. This is the one. This is the side I simmed at this point. This side I just flipped, and I used them. It still works, and that's in the final render. That's in the final clip. It still works for some reason, even though it's not 100% following the cracks. I would love to have done that though. Some other tests. Yeah, we're back. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So we're gonna continue looking at some of the stuff I did, and this is another test while I was working on this shot, and you can see the fire is not there yet, but I was testing how it would look like if the spaceship was moving through, and if the idea is going to work or not. And I wasn't happy with the result, to be honest, because it didn't click from this angle. It didn't work well. And this is the one I included in the R&D. I went all the way to rendering this with the atmospheric, with everything, and it looks great, but I'm not 100% happy with it. I did some smoke. I grabbed some old sims and put them there to show as if the spaceship had come off, and that's the leftover smoke. And this is my initial plan, was to have the ground collapse happen there, and then we would only see from this angle a smoke and the spaceship rising. We wouldn't see everything close up. And this is an initial test from the top view, same camera, same shot, same elements, just from different angle. This is a still image of the the edge displacement and the up-res workflow, and this is the final sim. Looks pretty cool. Still images, the lava still image, the final comp from this shot with the lava, the entire render of the fire, and a still frame of the final shot. Not the latest one, but one of the frames. I was testing the lighting, how it would look like at this frame, and just to see all the details I was testing. I wanted to have this contrast like I always do with blue and orange to complement the colors. And the only thing I would add here is I wanted to have some sort of lighting underneath, not lighting, but a lighting source underneath to reveal more of these cracks and to create more. If I have an atmosphere, I would see the rays coming off of this, and that would be very cool. And high-res image, we've seen this. Okay, let's continue. A ground collapse, we've seen this. And this is a fire smoke with the sparks. I was testing, this is the crack emission that I had in the shot one. I was trying to make the sparks look as natural as possible, and this is with caching velocity field from the sim and then running post sim, but there's more to the sparks. They're rotating, they're yeah, they're rotating. They have two sides and they have different textures. And they're stretching. You can see here. They're nicely stretching, streaking with the motion blur and all. Okay, so let's see. Oh, we've seen this. So this is another test of the destruction by itself and the spaceship coming. And this is the rays I was talking about. You can see by having a light source underneath, it actually creates a lot of interesting details. And this is the main sim without anything extra. Maybe not the latest, but one of them. Oh, actually, yeah, this is not the entire sim. It doesn't have the entire RBD sim because this part is very up-res. But I was testing what it would look like if I didn't have that orange light and it would only be lighting a source from underneath. Yeah, that spark, that lightning there, it's very cool. I'm gonna change this forever. We've seen this. Edge displacement test. And you can see there's a lot more details now here compared to the Voronoi. And you see how much details we have. And this is all one render. You can see the effect here of this block. It's gonna crumble, hit, then gets destroyed. Okay. And I was testing the constraints setup, so you can see the name have mixed constraint, which we'll talk about later. But there's many ways on how we can create this. And what I loved about this is this part, which reminds me of Star Wars, the spaceship coming off the ground. This is very, very cool. And this is what I was looking for, though the lightning and everything I had didn't sell this exact idea. And at this point, I'm still exploring this lightning, what it would mean to have something that bright underneath. The only problem is, see the noise here? That's very hard to solve, especially when we do edge displacement. It's going to be really hard for Arnold or any other render to solve the emission from that and all the shadows with the shadow interaction with that light and the geometry. So that's something a bit expensive if we want to go that route. But underneath it's very cool. This is a lava test. You can see the illumination of the lava onto the geometry. This is another test of you trying particles. So before I had the lightning propagation, I wanted to use everything. So anything that separates, I wanted to emit some sort of energy from. And this is one attempt at doing that. You can see the beginning, there's a small crack, and then this happened. Also, I was exploring timing. So you can see my timing here, it happens very, very quickly. 0 to 30, almost less than a second. That's my collapse. And then this, which happens in 4 seconds. So my timing is very different, but I wanted to keep that fast pace. I wanted to keep that, boom, 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 something happening very, very quickly. This is an early test. We've seen this. This is a preview from the top of that sim using particles. And this is the initial idea I had in mind. You can see, let's go through. You can see as the geometry separates, particles get emitted from it. And then it they fade off. And then the spaceship would come. And I was trying some ideas for how we could reveal or improve that part. This is the final render of this shot without any comp. This is the raw render with everything put together, like just A over B. But we're gonna make it look a lot nicer. Okay, let's see what else. Okay, so this is another test. With my idea was that I didn't want the fire to be on forever, just to see. So the fire would happen as soon as the geometry separates, and then it dissipates like a small blast. But it didn't work. I liked what made me decide, apart from Igor idea. This is one test that I did after he suggested doing the fire. I liked this lightning so much that I wanted to keep it forever. So I did that. I kept the fire on and it became a thing, and I left the fire on. This is a preview of the smoke, the dust sim of the spaceship rising and the various RBD destruction. This is the final sim. It's still frame. We're going to talk about that. So just a viewport capture. And this is one segment. Once we get there, we'll talk about this. But a preview of one cluster. You can see the full circle is not there. It's just one block, one corner. And I wanted to explore what it would look like if I have a lot more smoke coming off of the fire instead of just fire. This is not the debris. This is not the debris emitting smoke. This is the fire itself making a lot more smoke. And I wanted to fill the entire scene with smoke and then have the spaceship interact with it. It was too much. It was too much smoke, and it wasn't working. So I tuned it down. But this is one test of that. And then the final, which I'm going to play again. And in the next video, we're going to talk about some comp stuff. And my goal from this week is to give an in-depth overview of what happened, what we're going to do, what we are going to cover, and briefly how it was done. And I still have a couple more videos to record to hopefully go over this in more details. And then once we have a clear picture of what we have, I'm going to show the new composite of the various passes. And by seeing this, you guys will have an understanding of the final goal. What do we want to achieve? Now, this doesn't mean that this is the template to follow. Each project has different requirements, has different skills, has different constraints, and by seeing an entire project from A to Z, you will get a complete experience of how to work in production. And while I do this, I'm not trying to make the coolest sim or anything like that. I'm trying to create an interesting training material that can show production quality techniques. And with my current setup, we're going to be able to iterate. Let's say we get a feedback from a client saying, I want the smoke to be five times higher, or the fire to be 10 times bigger. We should be able to address that very, very quickly. If they want the sparks to be, different, we can change that very, very quickly. We have a complete flexibility over the setup. So as you guys saw, we have two main scopes. The ground collapse and its entire setup, and then the last shot, which is the crack and with a spaceship flying through. We're going to focus 100% on the ground collapse because this one is going to cover everything we need for the other shot. Now, I'm going to show what we're going to provide and my idea for what you guys should focus on and how to create something different. I'm going to provide the ground collapse scene, which includes the geometry, this part, the mountain, and then the ground itself. This is the destroyed version. Okay, I'm gonna provide a version that doesn't have any Voronoi fracture on it, the raw mesh. And so we'll get the raw mesh, you will get this, and then you will get the spaceship. The spaceship is, this is my version, which is a copy of, you can see the original one of the artist, and you are more than welcome to try, and this is what you should do. You should try and reuse this asset in any way you think it is possible. If you have a different asset, please feel free to use that. There is no restriction. In terms of idea, you can do a ground collapse like I did, or you can do the spaceship just rising from the ground. It doesn't have to be collapsing like they did in Star Wars, and I think that could be really, really cool. And you can have more than one spaceship, and the only thing is be careful of the distance, okay? Because I have a lot of resolution in my geometry and details. If you're not able to push all of that, that's perfectly fine. I'll provide 2 resolutions of each one, and you pick the camera and the version that you are able to handle. If you can't handle something very high res, that's perfectly fine. You can use the mid res and still get something decent. And then for the spaceship, you can decide any idea you want. You can have it even crash. If you want to crash the spaceship with, if you've taken the workshop, the destruction workshop, you should be able to create a collapsing ground or a crater from it being hitting the ground, and then you get all the smoke effect. You can emit fire from the cracks like we're going to be doing. You can use lightning, or you can have the spaceship flying and something hit it and it falls down. You can do whatever idea you want. I'm going to provide some material, and it's up to you to create something different. If you want to recreate exactly what I did, that's perfectly fine, and it will be yours. It will be different, and I'm sure it will look very interesting as well. Okay, so the next thing I will have is this. So I'm going to provide this geometry, which is the crack, and you can see the geometry, and it has an extension here. See, there's a nice blend. It's not very nice, but yeah, it works. And then it's both sides. You can see they close on each other. Okay, and you are more than welcome to create whatever you desire from this. My idea is that I made 3 copies every time I push them close to each other to close the gap. That's the environment I had with the camera like this. The only note is, if you go this route, if you want to use this, for example, and pick 1 or 2 and have them crumble into the lava, be aware that you will have a lot of new R&D that you will need to develop. My lava technique does not rely on sims, okay? It's purely procedural. And if you want to pursue the lava, you will have to go through fluid simulation and probably require the water FX workshop if you want to go that route. If you want to just collapse them and not show any interaction with the lava, that's perfectly fine. You can also process this geometry. I'm not so sure how, but you could, yeah, I don't have, maybe I'll provide one without any cracks. I will do that. So I will provide the geometry, a version of this that doesn't have any of these intermediate cracks, but it will be separated like this. So all these cracks will be closed, and then you will be able to blend shape between the two if you want to separate them. I don't know if I can make the blend shape, but hopefully you will have 2 versions that you can play with. With this, you can have, for example, rocks in here and have them collapse, and then maybe a cliff or something from this area collapses, or maybe the spaceship as it travels through, it hits everything and then it collapses. Now this is heavy. This geometry is heavy. Okay, you would probably want to use a low res version and add some sort of displacement at render time or something like that. But I'll provide this, and then it's up to you guys to develop whatever visual you want. I think it's very, very interesting. I think it can create a very cool environment, and you can definitely use any of the techniques. If you've taken Advanced Asset Workshop before, you can use that knowledge to scatter and improve this environment. You can build something like this, do whatever you would like. So that's what I will be providing, this, and then the spaceship, the other ground scene, and probably few cameras if you want to reuse the same ones. So I wanted to talk about what we're going to be covering during this workshop and briefly touch on the various topics and mention a few problems that we're going to be running into and how we're going to solve them and whether we have something in Houdini or not. Okay, so let me see. So we're going to talk about that in a bit. So the first thing, we have destruction. And with destruction, the main issue is how we're going to render that geometry. It's not so much about the sim or getting it done. It's more about rendering and making sure that it has enough resolution. Now, one way to add edge displacement, to add resolution, is to use edge displacement. And that will allow us to increase the resolution of the geometry at render time. One other thing that we should do is to transform the geometry at render time. Because we use PTC or points to deform the static geometry. So we take geometry, we fracture it, and then we transform it with points. The idea here is to export the static geometry one time. Okay, we cache it as whatever format we want, and then at render time we tell Mantra or Arnold to take that geometry, the static geometry at render time, and apply the transformation and apply the points. Mantra can do this, but the problem is if we have edge displacement and we're transforming a static geometry, it's going to be hard to multiply the vectors and apply the correct transformation to all the vectors that we need to displace the geometry. Okay, so that, for me, we're using Arnold, it's not possible. Even though I was able to get it to do the post-render transformation, I still could not get it to transform the points, the vector information, because the normal, if you have it pointing in the z-axis and then the piece is transformed somewhere else, you have to reorient that. So this plan here is off. We can't use this. So we have to rely on actual geometry. We have to rely on actual geometry, and I tried to keep it as low as possible in the scene and rely on edge displacement. Now, this is something that can be heavy and will be heavy. It requires subdividing the geometry at render time and then doing all this calculation. And it depends on what you're capable of in terms of rendering hardware. You should consider using this or not. And then we have another thing, because this is a large scale shot with the ground collapse. We have a massive ground collapsing, and then we wanted the spaceship, when it rises, it still interacts with the geometry. So my idea for this, I'm gonna spoil it, is when I have two resolutions. Okay, so I have this one, which is when the ground collapses. You can see the cracks here. And I have another resolution of destruction or fracturing that only happens when the spaceship touches the geometry. And I separated it. If we look at the scene here, you can see I've separated the low res part, which is this, versus the part that the spaceship is going to touch. And that's what the spaceship is going to touch. I've made a system that we do the destruction, the ground collapse first. We're happy with that. Perfect. We can work with the client to make sure that they approve that. We lock it in. We don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. Then we work on the second part, because if we keep changing both bits and make them dynamic, we're never going to get approval, because you change something, it's going to affect the other thing. So we have to lock it. That's my approach. I locked this bit, the ground collapse, done. A second sim that I did is using a subsolver to have the spaceship just go through that geometry and capture anything that touches. I isolated that geometry, which is this group. You can see random pieces here and there, but they're actually going to be affected in one way or another. And then I subdivided those again and run a secondary sim that has constraints in it. We'll go into more details. This allows me to focus on having only the details I need at the outer layer where I don't need extra details, and then keep the details only where I need them. Okay, so this is a very efficient workflow. And then if the director or the client comes and say, okay, I want more details, I want the debris to look like this, I want the pieces to be doing this, I can only work on that part. I only cache that part where the spaceship actually starts touching them, because all this part here, I have a version of this high-res geometry that matches this. It's a low-res version, and that's what I use up until the point before the spaceship hits. When the spaceship hits, I start simulating. So this portion here is going to only happen after frame 145. So that's when the sim is going to be. So I don't have to be paying twice or more to get the sim working. And it's actually activating piece in a smart way, and we'll talk more about that. So it's only simming what is needed. If a piece is not needed it's not going to be active, it will use the previous sim. And the first layer was actually quite fast. So we'll talk about that more when we get to destruction weeks. Okay, let's go back. So we have that's for destruction, and it's pretty much it. It's not very, very complicated. There's other stuff like emission stuff, but we'll get there. Okay, so now for smoke. When I talk about this shot, I'm gonna start with the complex one. So when I talk about this shot, I'm gonna call this the ground collapse. I'm gonna call this the crack shot. So for this one, you can see you have multiple cracks. So we have, as you guys saw, we have one block and about 10 sims here, and there's 10 more here, so 20 sims. And we're going to copy that. So 20 sims here multiplied by 3, that's 60 sims, all overlapping on top of each other, and they have to be high res and hold up enough. If we wanted to do different resolution for each block, we can definitely do that, or generate a low res version and use it as based on the camera distance. We can do that as well. But what I need is a smoke sim, and I need it to run it multiple times. Okay, and if we're going to store a velocity vector for these fields, it's going to use a lot of disk space, and we'll go into more of that later. We can, however, group all this and do a super crazy high-res sim, but that will require a lot of memory and may not necessarily save us anything at render time or in disk space. It could be a lot slower. So I needed to separate them. So a system that can, we need a system that will allow us to focus on one part, one cluster, and then we say, okay, I want to run it through all of these guys. So that's smoke sim. That's a multiple sim. And also for this shot, so that's one problem that we solved. So we need a clustering system. For this one, there's also a lot of problems, because if we wanted to push the resolution to the point where we have enough details for close-up, mid, and so on, we're not going to be able to do all that in one container. So what I ended up doing is splitting this into 4 segments. I called them, I believe, A, or cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, and 4. And it's sliced it like a pizza, but just in 4 segments. And then I can work on this and make sure it looks great, and then run the sim again on all the other clusters. This is for the fire, okay? Now, let me tell you a secret. Now, you see the fire here and the smoke? They're 2 different sims. I don't have smoke emitting, I don't have the fire emitting smoke. I would have loved to do that, but it actually is very expensive to render all that homogeneous volumes together, or anisotropic volumes. So I wanted to separate the fire. The other reason for that, if I'm going to have a smoke coming off of the fire, the director will say, okay, I don't want that. I don't like that. I don't like this smoke coming off of this fire. I want to change it. What will happen is that your fire will change. So you have this, when I decouple things, it's mainly for iteration purposes. When we have fire, just fire, we can focus on that, get it approved, done. The smoke is going to come from a different source, and that we can work on separately. And so let me turn these off. And so this approach helps me a lot with the sim, and I can defer things quite a bit. And because of this, I'm able to work on things quickly. I can distribute the task across multiple artists. If I wanted to have someone else work on that smoke, get it approved, they can do that, and I can focus on the fire, for example. And that's the approach. I did the fire separately, the smoke separately. Where was I? And then the other thing, I wanted to do the sparks, and I was showing in the top shot the sparks are, and the idea is based on the velocity. The velocity field is very expensive. Okay, so let's do a quick math. Or let's do a calculator. Let's say we have 10 sims, okay? 10 high-res sims multiplied by 2, that's 20 for each crack. And let's say the file size for fire and density is 100 megabytes, just to be safe. Okay, and then, let's do 20 multiplied by 100 megabytes for density and temperature, and 200 for velocity, which is conservative. So 300 total per cluster. So that's 6 gigabytes per frame. Okay, for 10 clusters. So let's see, 6 gigabytes for one frame, and if we multiply that by 100, that's 600 gigabytes just for one sim for one iteration. If we wanted to keep 10 versions, that's 6 terabytes just for one element. And I don't have that much capacity. We can't afford all that. So I needed a different system that will allow me to create sparks that follows the smoke sim, but without the velocity field. Okay, and I have a system for that. We'll talk about that later. And this mainly will mean that I can reduce this from 6 to 2. Okay, so I can reduce the disk space. Now, another very important thing is that disk space is crucial not just for when you write, it's when you read. If we have 20 sims, okay, we're duplicating them 3 times. That's 60 sims. Each one of them, let's say 200 megabytes. Okay, that's 1.2. How many? 1.2 terabytes. I can remember. 60 multiplied by 0.2. So 1.2 gigabytes of data per frame. To read that is going to take a lot of time, okay? Or 12 gigabyte of data. To read that every frame, it's going to take a lot of time, especially if you have, 150 megabytes read, it's going to take about 20 seconds just to stream that in. So we have to be very aware of all these things. If we're going to do production, we have to be very aware of how much disk space we're going to need. So for me, doing velocity caching is no way. I'm not going to be able to do that. And the top shot is actually very expensive. This one is easier because it has fewer sims. And I went with a much lower resolution for that top shot to save on disk space and make it faster to render. Okay, so we need a way to do sparks and have this interesting visual as well with the tornadoes, small tornadoes, and be able to iterate on each one of them. Okay, cool. So I clustered it to more than 4, and I will talk more about the other sims later. But basically, the center sim is separate from everything else. So I separated 4 blocks, and then I separated this center to be in its own sim. The reason for that is, again, I wanted to decouple things, because if the director comes back and say, okay, I want to have more smoke there, I can just change that. I don't have to resim everything. But if you were to start this without considering all that stuff, you would want to emit the fire from the smoke and then the spaceship to affect all of that. And then you get one comment from the director to say, I want to change the spaceship smoke to be 2 times denser. or to have more smoke there, you would have to redo everything. That's 1 week of sim. Just if you don't have resources, it can be more, but it's a lot of time. So that's why I decouple things, because I can make them different. I can quickly iterate on them, and I can, if I personally, that's for me as well, because I iterate over this stuff a lot. If I wanted to have something different there, I would just change that bit for the spaceship, and it would still be able to get the stuff I want. Okay, let's continue. So another thing that we should consider is I wanted to have a large atmosphere. Okay, what does that mean? Well, you see there's a fog here. There's a volumetric light. Everything it has volumetric. You see this has volumetric. This is volumetrics from the mountain. I wanted to sim that. I wanted to have an actual atmosphere that is moving. You can see the god rays here, they're not moving. And I wanted to be able to do that, and I will show how we can do that. But unfortunately, it was I run out of time, but the idea is to be able to cache all this data and do a giant sim that is not very high res, but can convey the illusion that this is happening, like something is changing in the atmosphere, because that's what will happen in this scenario. You will get a lot of dust everywhere. You will get a lot of movement and disruption in these areas. Though I don't have it, should be able to accommodate that in case the client asks for it. Rendering smoke plus fire plus sparks is challenging, as well as the illumination of all of that. So when we look at this stuff, it's actually quite complex to render, because what will happen is we have this light, okay? Will this light affect the fire or no? The fire is very bright, so this light doesn't affect the fire. Will any other light have to affect the fire? Most likely not. We want to have the fire be self-illuminating. Okay, so now we have this source. Will the fire affect the spaceship? Will the fire affect the smoke around it? Will it affect the sparks, or are the sparks only emitting light by themselves? They don't affect. Will the sparks be affected by this light? This main light. Will the atmosphere that we have affect any of this stuff in any way? Will the lightning affect the spaceship itself? All these links are very expensive. Okay, we have to always consider which one is going to affect which one is important to which one is going to be the most expensive bit to render. And for example, you can see I have volumetrics here in the entire environment. This light, all lights, they have volumetrics, but I don't have volumetrics from the fire itself, because that's very expensive. Okay, so we need to understand the relationship between these various elements and how we're going to approach that. Now we have also the problem of the cracks, though the cracks, they don't last for too long, but are they eliminating the geometry or not? Are they eliminating the fire or not? Are they eliminating the atmosphere or not? We have to think about all these combinations, because that's what experience is. We have to know this stuff. We have to efficiently render the bits that will make the visual sell really well. Don't look fake, but they are very efficient. So all this stuff I prepare for. I plan in my head as to what I'm going to do and how the links are going to happen between the various pieces. And you can see here, there's also the actual dust and smoke. Will it be affected by the fire or not? Will I have multiple scattering caused by this source into this smoke? There's two separate things, Will I have that or no? Will I be able to sell the visual if I don't have that, or is it something needed? So all these things we have to either have experience on or test them to see, what's the rapport, what's the cost of rendering this versus that, and if it's worth it or not. So all these stuff I think about. And always remember that we're going to be displacing all this stuff. all this geometry is going to be displaced. So a lot of memory usage. The rays are going to be traveling through a lot of details. There's so many things happening before it gets to the surface. And for example, the spaceship, will the spaceship be reflective or not? Will it reflect the smoke around it or not? And these questions are very expensive. They can make the render become very, very expensive. And so we have to think about all this interactivity things. Okay, so I talked about that. Okay, so then for the lava, how we're going to do this lava thing. I have the crack shot. I have this crack with the lava flowing. How am I going to do that? Am I going to sim it? If I'm going to sim that, it's a huge, large environment. How am I going to be able to sim a huge, massive, like a river, basically flowing of lava? Can I do something different? Can I use something procedural? If I'm going to do something procedural, how will I create the lava itself? So all these things we have to develop. We have to do R&Ds for. I don't have solutions for them when I started, and but I ended up implementing, and I'm going to show my solutions. So we have to consider all these bits. Okay, so for the magical lightning, I called it magical. For the magical lightning, it's going to be particles and SOPs based. So particle sim and SOPs. We're going to have a growing geometry, the growing path. How we're going to do that, those growing paths. How we're going to find the end, the center and the end bit, where they're going to end, how they're going to travel, and how to get that nice tree-like structure. It's only propagating correctly. And the interconnectivity, there is interconnectivity between the paths, and it's actually quite challenging to find to get this path. So you can see here it's starting to grow, and then this one, it's split. One went this way and one went this way, and this one went this way and this one went this way, and it kept going on. It kept continuing. So it's very clever as to how it's going to spread. It's not just one blast that's going to be bolting out. It's actually propagating and spreading as it goes through that geometry. And these cracks are matching the geometry. Now, will these cracks deform the geometry? If yes, how? Will these, the magical, will these magical emit any debris or cause any other things? If they will do that, how will it look like? Are they made of particles, curves, or something else, or volumes? Will they interact with the geometry lighting? If yes, how we're going to do that? So all these things I think about. And another major problem is if we wanted these cracks to deform, how are we emitting them? Are we creating them on a flat plane where the geometry is flat, or are they actually being emitted from here and traveling through? If yes, how will they deform with the geometry? Because our geometry is deforming at that point. If we build this path like this, after 2 frames, it changed. It's here. So the entire system has to be deforming like everybody else. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to have it stick to the geometry? It looks simple, but it actually is really complex. And then here, you can see the end bits, when they reach, they emit this spark. And that times with the geometry getting flipped and interacting. So all these questions we have to answer. And then the interaction, elimination, where and how. So basically, what element affects what and what's important? Will the atmospherics be affected by this, by that, and all that stuff we need to consider. Rendering passes, how I'm going to separate this. So I think about all these. Things as I progress. How I'm going to separate it in a very smart way that allows me to quickly iterate over things. Okay, I want to change the spaceship, I can change the spaceship. I want to change the color of the cracks, I can change the color of the cracks. I want to be able to control all of that. I want to turn off this light, I can do that in comp, all this. And I need to consider ways of that will allow me to do this, because when I do this render, I actually don't want to re-render it again. I want to do multiple small renders, iterations to test bits and pieces. But when I go full on, I test a couple of frames, start the comp. If they work great, I'm going to do this one time. But then you get feedbacks from the clients. You need to be able to address those. You can't go back and say, oh, I'm going to re-render this, I'm going to look at this. You have to be able to address that. So I need to provide myself or the compositor as much flexibility as we can to allow them to do that work. If they wanted to change this sparks to green, okay, or red, what if we integrated the illumination of this blue color into the main pass, into the main rocks? Then we wouldn't be able to change it. Doesn't matter what we do to the particle, it's always going to be blue. So we need to separate that so we can have that flexibility. So all this we're going to talk about, we're going to solve, we're going to create, we're going to do it. And last thing is I'm going to talk about the hardware and disk space. I talked about briefly. It's not a major issue, but I'll talk a bit more about that. And then we're going to talk about the compute power. So let's talk about disk space. Let's say we have 10 sims and each one of them is 100 megabytes. Okay. So that's 1 gigabyte per frame, and we have about 250 frames. So that's 250 gigabytes for 10 sims, which is not the case. We have about 20, actually more, but let's say 500 gigabytes for one iteration. Okay. We're going to do way more than one iteration in a project. We're going to do probably 10 of those sims. We'll work on smaller bits of course, but we will need at least 5 terabytes for one sim to account for multiple versions. So we're talking about, to be safe, 6 terabytes. Maybe no, we need 8 terabytes just to be safe, to iterate over destruction, do the EXRs. If we wanted to do deep render, if we wanted to do anything extra, we'll go with 8 terabytes. Okay, that's great. So let me write this down. Now, let's say on the render time for one frame is 30 minutes, or let's go 20 minutes. 20 minutes per frame, which is very conservative. For my case, it was a lot more. But we don't have one pass. We have a lot more passes. We have the geometry, the main geometry. We're going to have smoke, probably multiple smoke passes. We're going to have atmospherics. We're going to have sparks. So let's say we have 10 passes. Okay. So 20 minutes multiplied by 10, 200 minutes per frame. Divide that by 60. That's 3 hours per frame. Let's round it. 3 hours per frame. And we have about 250. So 3 multiplied by 250, so 750 hours. Divide by 24, that's 31 days of rendering. Now I'm talking about dual Xeon's time here. I'm not talking about the normal CPUs. If we were to be using normal CPUs, we would be doing this. So with dual Xeons, let's say we get a 48 cores machine. Multiply that by 2.3 gigahertz. Okay. So let's do the math. This is 31 days. So let's do total render time. 31 days. And this is on a 48 cores machine. So to make this 31 days be less, we need 10 machines, 10 render nodes to make that render in 3 days. Okay, so we need to split. We need to multiply the render nodes, get it done in 3 days. Perfect. That's very, very good option. But now let's compare the normal CPUs. We have 48 cores at 3.2. 48, 3.2, that's 110 gigabytes. Now we get those i7s or whatever, the gaming stuff. And we have 8 cores at 4 gigahertz. So that's 32 gigahertz total. There's about difference of 3 times. It's going to be more, but let's say 3 times. So instead of 31 days, you actually need 91 days or 93 days. Let's say 90 days with one machine rendering. Pardon me. And to make that work less or get it done faster, we need, let's say 10 nodes, that's 90 days. We need 30 nodes to get it done in the same time. Okay, so I don't have any of this. Okay, I don't have any hardware. I need to be able to do this. I need to be able to have 10 render nodes and render all of this in 10 days. Well, if you're working for a client, you should be able to afford that. So what our studio does, what Rebelway, when we work in VFX, we rent. I'm lucky enough to be in LA. They have a very good place that we can rent hardware from. And I'm going to show it. I'm going to show the numbers. And then I'm going to show what it actually means to buy this, whether with Xeons or AMD in the next video. Okay, so we need 10 nodes. That's it. I'm going to go to American Computer and Engineering. They are they work for VFX. So this company rents nodes and sells nodes, and I get stuff from them. So whether you need multi-GPU, RAID storage, actually let's take a look at the storage. So we talked about 8 terabytes. They have a lot more. So they have a lot more capacity if you need that. But we can get this 24 terabytes for 1 month. We work on the project and then buy one or two drives of 4 terabytes each, or one for 8 terabytes. And let's do the math. And then cache everything. So not this one. So, okay. So let's quickly talk about the hardware. Let's say we need we need a blade. Pardon me. We're going to rent that 24. That's going to be 790. Let's say 800. And then we need about 200 to cache. I'll explain why. So 1K just for rental 1 month. The 200, I'm going to buy an Iron Wolf 8 terabytes with and cache the latest version of everything. I'm not going to cache everything. I'm not going to cache the 8 terabytes. This so that when the client comes back, I can still go back to that project and use it. I'll go to 400 just to be safe. So 1.2K hard drive. So we need 10 nodes. Let's see. I'm going to go home, render nodes. And they have 2 options. This is very advanced. This is if you have a server, you have a case, you can plug it in and needs special cooling, and it's more for studios. So if you want to go that route, they have each node. So this is a 4 node. So you have 4 CPUs, 4 computers in this node. Okay. And each one of them has 2 Skylakes, has 2 CPUs. You can see the CPU power here. Okay, so we can rent one of these, which is pretty good. You have 8 cores, 8 CPUs. So let's do the math. I'm gonna go with the smallest one first. So we did the calculation based on 110 gigabytes and gigahertz, and we actually need this much power. By 10 nodes, I need 1100 gigahertz. So this one, let me open the calc. I hope you guys find this interesting. So we have 8 cores multiplied by 8. That's 64 CPUs, or 64 cores multiplied by 2.1. 8 multiply by 8 multiplied by 2. So 128 gigahertz. This is quite low. No, I think, yeah, this is, so 8 multiplied by, yeah, 4 nodes, 8. That's correct. Multiplied by 2. So each node has 128 gigahertz. Okay, we need more than that. We need 10 of these. Okay, so if we want to go with this route, it's 9,000 to rent them for 1 month. 9K. Okay, so this is for studios, for professionals. I don't have this. We don't have access to host these servers. So what I get instead is workstations. And this is something you can work on. So if you're an artist, this is a great option. So let's go. So with these, you will get 2 CPUs on each one. Okay, I'm gonna go with the most expensive one, the 24 cores, 2.7 gigahertz. It's better to get these two and pay for the price versus having a cheaper one and smaller price. Okay, so let's go with the expensive one. Let's say it's 1,000. Okay, I'm gonna say 24 cores multiplied by 2 multiplied by 2.7. This is great. And then I can multiply this by 10. I have approximately what I need. And it's the same ratio. I'm gonna rent 10 workstations and it's 1,000 each. That's 10K. So we have another 10K for 1 month. That's it. You're going to rent them for 1 month. Well, you don't need them, but the minimum is 1 month. We could go with less than this. So we could rent only 5 workstations and finish this in 6 days, which is not bad. But let's say we need 6K hardware for 1 month. Okay, so this is for the hardware. Now for the licenses. These 10 nodes, or 5 nodes, we're going to get 5 nodes. We need Arnold licenses. So 600 each, 0.6, that's 3K Arnold. Okay, and then we need Houdini. For Houdini, we only need the render engine. We don't need the full license. And that's 0.7K, so $700 for the render license. It's a floating license, so we can use it on any machine. We need 5 of them. So that's 3.5K. So 6 plus 3 plus 3.5, that's 12.5K just hardware to be able to do this in a reasonable amount of time with the software and hardware you need. So this is some numbers for you guys to think about, which is reasonable because that hardware is a lot more expensive. If you wanted to buy this 24 cores, it's actually $14,000. Okay, and it's 48 cores. Each one is 24, and this one is $8,000. So if you wanted to buy 10, that's $80,000. Okay, so for the other way is to look into AMD. This is all Xeon stuff. Okay, and for AMD, we have few options. They're not cheap. They seem cheap, but they're not cheap. So we have the 2990WX, and then we have AMD 2970X, and I believe 6, and then the new ones. So 3990X, this is 4K, just the CPU. And then we have, I believe, this, which is 2K for the CPU. And then we have 2K USD. And then this, I believe, 7, which is 1K or 1.2K. And then 3960, which is 0.6. And it goes like this. It goes 64 cores at 2.3. I'm not sure, but something like that. This one goes 32 multiplied by 3 gigahertz, I believe, or 3.2. Go for the higher. And then this one has 24 cores at 3.6. And this one has 16 cores. We'll go at 4. So let's do the math for each one of these. So 64 multiplied by 2.3, that's 774. Very good. And then 32 multiplied by 3.2, it's 102. And this allows you quickly to understand how fast each CPU is going to be compared to the other one. So you can do the math, and it's not going to be correct for sims and things like that, but it will be correct for renders all the time. So 24 cores multiplied by 3.6, it's 85, it's 200, and then this one is going to be 16 multiplied by 4, 64. We'll do 60 just to round it. I think it's slower. Okay, so that's the ratio. We need 1100. So we need either 5 of these, 10 of these, 10 of these, or 20 of these. And these ones, they're not cheap. This one is 4K CPU, this one is 2K CPU. And let's say you're gonna build this, okay? Let's say we go with this one, we need 10 nodes. It's 2K for CPU, plus 500 for motherboard, 500 for memory, plus 500 for case, PSU, and things like that. So 500, 500, 500, plus 2000. That's 3.5K minimum per workstation. If you're gonna buy 10, that's 35K, plus the hardware, the cost of licenses and everything. So even if you go with AMD, it's not gonna be that cheap. It's still going to be costly. Now, this, I didn't include sim time at all. I only included render time. Sim time, we're going to need similar power for at least 2 months, not just one, because they're going to be slower. You cannot, the only problem with sim, you cannot distribute them. I mean, you can cluster them manually, but it's not like rendering a sequence where each node is going to get a frame, do the same thing, and done. With the sim, you have to wait for the first frame, to finish the last frame, you have to wait for all the frames to finish, not like the render. So even if you have 100 machines, you're not going to be able to use all of them for sims. So you need at least 4 workstations for 2 months to provide that capacity. And this is what it would look like in terms of numbers. And I wanted to make sure that you guys are aware that this stuff is not cheap. It's going to cost a lot of money if you wanted to work from home or start your own studio or just rent. It's going to be expensive. No, other solutions would be, I believe, cloud. Amazon has something. I haven't tested. Igor did. And then there's another one. I can't remember now. They offer Houdini sims. The Grid Market. So Grid Market, guys, they have online nodes that you can rent. You can submit jobs and rent. But the thing with that is that when you submit a sim online, it stays online. You cannot work on it locally. So you have to do you have to download one frame, one cache, and then test it. It's not ideal. And it's also very expensive. If you do the math, if you try and submit a job, it's probably going to be more expensive than this. Maybe less, maybe similar, especially with the license price and stuff. And another very important thing is electricity. Electricity can be anywhere from 200, I don't know, depending on where you live, to 600 if you run all these nodes for 1 month. Okay. So it's going to be a lot of heat. It's going to be a lot of electricity that you have to pay for. And it's just a lot of compute power. Now, what I recommend doing is, because this is too expensive, accessible only to production stuff and people who can afford it, you can do stuff with normal equipment. So let's say, I'm going to Google something super quick. I'm gonna show 1 second. So this. So I have this this river here that is 5 years old. It's probably more, 6 years old, and I've done this on an i7 that is 10 years old at home. And you can see I have high-res sims, high-res everything, trees. It's fully fleshed. The only thing is the render was low res. I was only able to render 960 by 540, but it still looks good. It's not gonna deteriorate the quality of the work. This one we did using only 2 machines, 2 i7 machines. I only had 1, Igor had 2, and we did the same render everything on those 2 machines, and it still looks good. The only thing is the resolution. We couldn't afford to render, HD or 1280. So key is always lower the resolution. 960 by 540, something looks really nice, and it doesn't have to have a huge amount of resolution. It will look good at that resolution. For sims, my recommendation is to always have 2 workstations. Not just for sims, for doing effects. If you want to do effects, you have to have 2 workstations. They can be i7. You can get them from eBay for $500 each, have 64 gigabytes on them, DDR3, perfect. You work on one, and then when you have something, you test, you like it, you send it to the second machine, and you continue working. Okay, you don't pause. That's the key. You have something on the background cooking, doing something for you. That's how you can make progress. If you're gonna have just one machine, that's gonna slow you down. Now, the other thing, if you work full time, you only have a small amount of time at night. And depending on how your setup is, if you have your computer in your room, my recommendation is to work when you have time, and then submit whatever you have. It doesn't matter what. Always submit a sim. Every night submit a sim, take some notes, and do a preview of it. And that will allow you to make progress. You go to work in the morning, you come back, the sim is done. Just make sure you have enough memory and you have enough disk space. Those are the 2 requirements, and you can make a lot of good stuff with just small equipments. It doesn't have to be this expensive. But if you wanted to do more advanced stuff, this is the real numbers. This is what production pays. This is what you will need to do high quality work. Part of being an FX artist is to iterate a lot over the visual of the final results. Once you build various FX layers, especially if it's magical, if it's sci-fi, or things that require a lot of transparency and particles and glow and things like that, there's a lot of things that needs to happen in comp to create the final look. And part of being an FX artist is to have a capability and access to one of these tool sets, whether it's Fusion, Nuke, or DaVinci, or After Effects, anything that allows you to comp A over B, do some color correction, add some glows, and do a render. Now, we're going to have a dedicated Nuke workshop, so I don't expect you guys to fully master this part, but it's very, very important to understand that Nuke is a very important piece of the puzzle in building complex visuals. And I'm going to show my workflow and how much I rely on it. As well as doing the final composite is testing and iterating over the visual. And this means that I will start doing some renders and then set up a bunch of AUVs and multiple lights, light AUVs, and then relight it in comp. So separate the AUVs and then relight it in comp to find and quickly fine tune each light intensity and color and see what works best. Sometimes I even render out white light with one intensity across all of them, and then just name them at different AUVs, import them into Nuke, separate everything, and then comp to find something that I like, and then I go back and reapply the results back into Houdini and have that in the final render. Now I'm going to show, before I dive into the final composite, and this is a simplified version of the final shot that I'm going to briefly go through, before I do this, I want to show an iterative state of me testing various things. So while working on this, I'm still not certain how it's going to work, how it's going to look like. So I need, because I don't have previs, I don't have a storyboard, I don't have any of that. I have to test things myself. So here I go and just use the segment for destruction and try to render everything together. Separate the smoke, 2 passes, 1 for everything and 1 for smoke only. And then I import them into Nuke and start working on the various passes, separate the lights again and try to tweak them. And this is a top render. I don't think I rendered this. And I separated the various AVs. You can see them here, each one for each light. So I have the orange, I have the blue, I have a top light, I have an indirect pass, I have an environment light, which is very dim. And I just separate everything and try to recomp it to make it look interesting and see if it works visually. And then, okay, this part I like, I'm going to continue exploring this. So I add the smoke. And then it feels very, very weak. I don't like the smoke. I don't like how the overall look of it. So I start looking at adding atmospheres, which helps with selling the scale of the entire scene. So I do that, I add it, and then I kept on iterating this. Okay, it works from this angle. I like it. It works in this frame and so on and so forth. I continue exploring. So this is a different camera to see how it's going to work. And you can see I have atmosphere here with just 1 light. It's simpler, no mountains, no ground. And actually I didn't have them at that time. I was just working on this part. And to me, it looks like it's gonna work. Like, I really like what I have here. But if I look at the initial render, it's pretty basic. This is what I have. And then I comp that stuff to make it look more interesting, rebalance everything, and just continue on that path. This segment was quick to render. I could run it overnight and come back tomorrow and it's ready. And so I continued exploring all this. And then I added some more ground. This is where I started working on the outer layer. I didn't have it at that time, but I was sure that I'm going to be able to blend it in nicely. So I added that part, which I changed in the final version, as you guys saw. And this is the different version with the atmosphere. So having access to Nuke like this is very, very powerful, and it allows you to test things and improve the visual and see whether it's going to work or not. And then from this, I went back to Nuke. Okay, I'm certain now everything is going to be fine. It's going to work. My visual is going to look nice. Let's refine everything. So I went back to Houdini, worked on the terrain, worked on the shaders again, worked on the lights again, make sure that everything is well balanced, everything looks nice, tweak the settings and the various AVs. And here again, I still have another stage of exploring, which I'll talk about later, but we have more elements here. We have the sparks, we have the light, the lightning of the ship, we have the ship. And by that time, I figured out how I'm going to solve and render all the passes. So this is my main pass, which is what I ended up doing. I did a comp trick that I will explain once we get to week 8 to give me this underneath fire feeling. You can see that all these cracks, they feel like they're burning, even though I don't have fire yet. So that's all fake in comp. And this is the original render. Now, it looks basic, but it actually has a lot of AVs that will allow me to improve the visual. And I don't want to overcomplicate this yet, but this is the raw render, and this is after tweaking. Okay? Not a huge difference, but it's very crucial. Okay, this is the blue, so the blue bolts. And for the sparks, for the magical, this is the render. That's it. And then comp stuff to make it look like this. Cool. So then I have the smoke. So let's go to a different frame. And everything is rendered together. So all smoke is one pass. And then after tweaks, it looks like this. Now I did a trick. This is how the smoke looks like, okay? Not this version. This is how the smoke looks like. I'll explain why it's exposed like this later. So this is the raw render, and this is after tweaking. It's not a major difference, but it makes quite a bit of difference to have these lights tweaked and get the proper rims and stuff like that, and this overexposed area and the fire and all that stuff. It's very important. These small tweaks are what sells and combines the visual nicely. Okay, so then I have the shipped blue effect, the illumination effect added on top, and then everything together combined. And it looks like the ship is not there, so let's see where it's coming from. Yeah, so that's the ship. And then I have the sparks, which is a separate pass. So this one, you see, I ended up not, the smoke is not abstracting any of it. Okay, so the sparks are visible no matter what the smoke density is. This bit is always visible. But I did something in comp to fix some of that. We'll talk about it when we get there. Just this is a separate pass, and it allows me to, control it, tune it down, remove it if I wanted to, because it's not embedded. I can still only if I get comment on this, I can go back and work on my sparks forever and render it. It will be super fast, no cost. But if it was integrated in the smoke pass or on the geometry pass, it would be a nightmare to re-render because it's going to be very expensive. Cool, so that's all combined, geo, smoke, and so let's put a dot here. So this is the geo, this is the smoke, everything combined. And then with the sparks added, and then I have my atmosphere. So this is my Atmo pass. It looks like this. All the lights included, but I separate them as individual lights, and then that allows me to tweak my volumetric in any way I want. And I did tweak it a lot to get the effect that I want. And then some fake glow from the fire, we'll talk about that. And you can see this light here. I carefully animated this light. This is a strong orange light in the center. It's outside the frustum, but it's still affecting. We're still getting this. It's actually very weak. If we look at the render, it's not visible. If you look at this, it's not very, very visible. It is very visible, but it's not how I wanted it to be. So I was animating the value of this light to give me the effect that it's, when it's aligned along the camera, it's actually brighter. When it's away from the camera, it's less intense, or vice versa. So it looks like when you look at something, it glares, but when you look at it from a different angle, it fades off. So that's the effect I was looking for. And then I have the lightning, which is a separate pass. And this is, where is my lightning? Okay, so this is a very basic curve, just using a carve node with a noise on it, and it just shows up for a few frames. It does this, and then boom, that's it. And all the trick is happening in comp. So all these effects are happening in comp. And then I added that on top. So this is one frame. There's also lighting with this. So if I gain it up, you will see that the lightning is actually illuminating. So that's something I wanted to add, but it's not very visible in the final version. And then with this, I have a couple of other distortion effect and chroma, just to make it, just to sell the idea that this is very bright, so it changes the entire camera, and I animated some stuff so the effect is much stronger when the lightning happens, and then it's off, and then we have the rest of the shot. So that's it. I'm gonna do this quickly. I'm gonna copy this, this, and this, and this. I'm gonna paste them here. So these are the main passes, that's it. This is my main, I'm gonna comp it. And this is my B. And I'm gonna reformat to make sure that everything is the same. Go 720. And let's find the frame where the bolt is, the effect is there. Okay. So I'm gonna use a plus for these two. And then we have the smoke. And the smoke is quite bright, so we need to tune it down. So I'm gonna use a grade, just lower its intensity. And this is an over. So that's our smoke. Let's go to a different frame like that. And then our atmosphere. So I'm going to use a grade and also tune it down. And I'm going to merge it. For now, I'm going to use a plus. Later, we'll take a look at something else. Okay, so that's the Atmo. And then we have the sparks, which I'm going to add here. And this is going to be a plus. Okay, so this is the original render, and this is the final comp. So original, final, and let's reformat this as well. And that's what you can do in comp. And let's go here. Cool. I hope you guys find this useful, and we'll provide enough training for this. We'll build the comp from scratch so that everybody understands what I was doing and why I was doing it, and hopefully you guys will be able to use this knowledge. Thank you so much for watching this, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.